Hello and welcome anew to SBS 300. This is Juan Jose Gutierrez, and we're going to continue talking about Talcott Parsons and the different theoretical aspects of his work. Today I have prepared for you a series of slides that will help me go through key elements of the theory of Talcott Parsons, trying to recap some of the things that we started discussing on the last session, and go over some of the topics that probably need a little further explanation and elaboration. I want you to know that I'm posting on iLearn the totality of the notes that I'm using for this session today. Notes come from a professor at the University of Chapel Hill in Carolina, and I found the notes to be quite useful to organize some of the things that I needed to say. So I'm posting the entirety of the notes, but my presentation will just cover some of the aspects that are included in that presentation. All right, so Talcott Parsons, one of the things that was mentioned in the last session was that he's an American sociologist. So Parsons is perhaps the most important figure in the 20th century, or the most salient initial figure of American sociology in the 20th century. Born and raised in Colorado Springs, Colorado, so he was aware of cold winters and warm summers. From a religious family, his father was a congregational minister, and like many of the other authors that we have explored, religion is always on the backstage of how these theories and ideas of world are performed, and it is always important to keep an eye on the context that explains the person that we're studying. He went to Amherst. I don't know if you're familiar with Amherst, but Amherst is a university that it's to this day very well known as a place where most of the progressive thinking is being organized and discussed and advanced. So in that sense, he was one of the most important precursors of a great college, Amherst College in the East Coast. Then he has an interesting European experience as he goes to London to the School of Economics, which is the most important reputable institute in England for social sciences. He is exposed in there again. It's important for you to keep an eye on things that he's been exposed to, radical thinking, and by that it's normally in Europe radical thinking will be progressive leftist work. And interesting note on his life is that he's married to Helen Walker, and he's married for the whole life. I just found that it was interesting because Talcott Parsons is a person that is fundamentally interested in understanding how the systems remain as they are. So stability is like a central concept in his theory, and it seems like stability was part of his personal life insofar as the marriage. He has, like many of the other authors of the 20th century, a very direct experience and even dramatic experience with the events in the Second World War, and all of this really marks the way people think of society. In France, for example, the experience of the Second World War was very direct and immediate and experientially very dramatic. And so after the war, you have the prevalence of authors that are existentialist in nature, existentialist meaning that they really wondered what was the true meaning of existence, and in many cases it's a very somber view of existence and a very pragmatic and if not cynical view of existence. He's got his work is definitely impacted on the issues that happen in the Second World War, but his take is to create systems that will be durable and sustainable. He becomes to prominence in the discipline, particularly in 1949, when he becomes the president of the American Sociological Association, the most important and widespread association of social scientists of the time. And so he has a very plentiful life with lots of writing and lots of teaching, and he dies in 1979 at an advanced age. One of the things that I want you to remember, and that I will probably take into consideration when creating my exam for this class, and so I want you to pay attention to this, is the key characteristics of his work. First of all, Talcott Parsons is like some of his contemporary authors, friends and colleagues. He's advocate of grand theory. So he's looking to create and to contribute to an understanding of society that is all-encompassing and that it's generalizable, that it really explains all different facets of social life. And so in that sense, this is a very ambitious system that is being created by his work. That leads to understanding the titles of most of his writings, like The Structure of Social Action, 1937, and Social Systems. So he really explains the key central components of social life and social action. He has been influenced by Weber, Pareto, which we didn't explore because we have just enough time during the semester to do some of the main authors, but we're familiar with Emile Durkheim, and you know that he's been influenced by these two that we know of, and certainly by Pareto. Main goal or main contribution of his theory, just like Marx was class and Durkheim was about defining the social fact, we need to tie the word action theory with the name Talcott Parsons. So he's trying to explain how action happens in society, and he writes a theory in order to do that. All right. So in terms of summing up what's critically important of Parsons' work, I want you to remember this and to study this and to keep in mind this. First of all, that Parsons is known because of his because he goes to Europe and brings the teachings of classical social theorists to the United States to make it canonical. That is, the reason why you and I have been talking about Weber, Durkheim, and some of the authors that we're talking about is because individuals like Parsons, and particularly because Parsons was influenced in Europe while he was in London and then in Germany and other places, but mostly in London. And he was influenced by these classical theorists, and then that becomes part of the foundation of the teachings and learnings in the US. And then the second thing that is critically important to remember is that he has been working in terms of creating an integrated theory that is all-encompassing, and that is in that sense grand theory. I've mentioned this before in class, but there are three different levels of theoretical approaches. One is grand theory, which is most of the authors that we have seen thus far. Then middle ground theory, that is theories that are more specific to certain subfields or phenomena in society. Like, for example, when we talk about the theory of crime and violence, conflict theory, those theories encompass not everything but just aspects of social life. And then grounded theory, which is theories that are specifically developed to explore and explain very pointed issues or phenomena in social life or cultural life if you are an anthropologist. So of those three levels, you have to remember that his work is at the level of grand theory. He's really trying to explain in the most abstract of the ways, the most abstract of the problems that are there for us to study and understand. He is also keenly interested in exploring variables. There's one noticeable trait of Talcott Parsons' teaching and writing, and I didn't mention that the other day, but it's worth bringing, is that he is always looking for patterns, for paradigms, for structural elements that can help us understand in a concise, schematic way what's going on in society. even some of the ways in which he presents his theories will be precisely looking for and creating these somewhat at times artificial arrangements of ideas, right? Even using acronyms to explain certain things. I will come back to this issue later on. But he is very interested in looking for pattern variables, and that is reflected in not just in his study, but in the way he presents his studies. And then last but not least, an area of his writing that is critically important is that of action theory, sort of explaining how activities and action happens within the society, and more importantly within specific social systems. In a way, social systems are aspects of the larger society, right? So those are sort of characteristics that we want to remember when we talk about Talcott Parsons. Okay, let's start talking about some of his beginnings. As we explored initially, he is a structural functionalist author, and by that we mean, as you already know, that he understands or he uses this metaphor of an organism to explain and understand society. So his main focus is on structural functionalism, means that he's going to be concerned with social systems and institutions, pattern variables, and then the components that integrate the larger society. So for social systems and institutions, he would be seeing how society functions, because we have different subsystems with specific roles and normative orders that frame the actions of individuals, which become social actors. So subsystems, for example, the law and how we play the law and enact the law in a society, that has its own language. So not anyone can be a judge or a justice or an attorney. You need to have earned the language, you need to understand what are the parameters of that subsystem, and then play by those rules. And so those will be the subsystems that have similar patterns that he's trying to explain. So each system has a uniqueness in that is defined for certain goals and goal attainment. But to attain those goals, you have to have certain norms and rules of action, and then action happens because you have those elements of context. Therefore, if you are interested in social systems, subsystems, etc., you are going to have to understand the patterns that emerge, that actually explain and make visible those orders, normative and otherwise, that provide context to social and individual action, right? Some of those pattern variables that he's looking for are the private life versus the collective life, universal issues versus particular issues, achievement ascription, and then the roles that each actor will play in as they engage in a social subsystem. And then insofar as the society breakdown, which is an important point to keep in mind, and I think has strong explanatory power, he sees society integrated in different layers, if you like. One would be the cultural system. That is the very sophisticated system of symbols and expressions that we use to organize cultural social life, right? As I was giving you the example of the legal realm, how we have all the symbols that we use to enact life in that specific subsystem. Then the personality system, which is now a new contribution from Parsons, which he's paying attention to the individual and individual action. He talks about the unique identity that actors will bring to the system, And then, of course, the social systems in and of themselves, which he defines as modes of interactions between actors. So again, the novelty of his work will be that he's bringing the subject, the individual, to the forefront, whereas other social theories of the past and all those European social theories that he was exploring as when he had his experience in Europe were not so keenly interested in bringing the individual to the forefront. For many, this is more an expression of the cultural context that Talcott Parsons lived in, that is the cultural life of the US, which is more of an individualistic society than others, than anything else. So what I'm trying to say is that Talcott Parsons is seen elsewhere in the world, and I can tell you that because I was trained somewhere else in the world, as this typical US author that saw individuals and individualism as core, whereas in some other societies that's not the main value, if you like, cultural value. Interesting. So let's start with the bottom of my slide right here. How does a society maintain itself? That's a big question for Talcott Parsons. How does a society maintain itself? This is very functionalist, because it is equivalent to asking, how is it that an organism remains whole and alive? So why is this question so relevant? Well, he is coming also from and interested in sociocultural evolutionism, which is, for example, the theories that Comte advanced in terms of saying how societies go from primitive to complex, and an idea that was later also taken by Durkheim and all of the other authors, right, that talk about primitive societies and complex societies, mechanical solidarity, which will belong to primitive societies, and organic solidarity, which belongs to more complex arrangements and social arrangements. So coming from this understanding that societies change and become more complex through time, then his question remains, right? How the society manages to maintain itself, and how is it that we can understand the remaining in time as a key value of a social arrangement, whereas on the other hand, we also understand that societies change and vary through time. So those are the questions he's grappling with at the most generic and abstract level that you can imagine. But now I would like to start a segment sort of explaining this agile template or paradigm that he puts together in terms or with the intention of explaining action for systems and subsystems. To make it a little more palatable to you, and this is how I my best shot at explaining this, is that as you may remember, so he's first and foremost, he's interested in action, in individual action, and most of his work has been a theory of action. But on the other hand, he moves gradually more and more towards a functionalist perspective. So let's entertain that idea for a second. So functionalist perspective, you know that it is that metaphor of society as an organism, where function is the main idea that will help us explain the different components of the social complex in which we live. Said before that just think of your society. We have systems of transportation, systems of policing the norms and rules that we give ourselves to be able to live together. We have health systems, we have educational systems. All those of systems have an internal life of its own, and together they function to provide society with the means to remain whole as one integrated body. And the world is comprised of many different societies. There's a society in the US, there's a society in Mexico, in Canada. Each of those arenas of social interaction can be and are explained as different societies, right? Each society has different variations of cultural norms, intended goals, etc., that are defined by those individuals collectively. So to explain how action happens, we need to take into consideration the concept of function. And function, it is defined by Talcott Parsons as a complex of activities directed towards meeting the need or needs of the system. So that is the function, which should be fairly easy to understand if we keep that metaphor of the organism. What is the function of the lung? The lung will expand and contract to bring air. The air is charged with oxygen, and the oxygen is transmitted to the organism through cellular components in the bloodstream. The red cells will take the oxygen, and there you go, right? So the same applies to each and every one of the subsystems. Now, there are 4 functional imperatives. Let me repeat this. 4 functional imperatives that are needed for all systems to work appropriately. And those 4 functional imperatives are the ones that he is labeling as A, the function of adaptation; G, the function of goal attainment; I, the function of integration; and then L, the function of latency. That is, the latency is the word that he used to refer to pattern maintenance. So let's explore these 4. First, adaptation. Like any other organism, a system or a subsystem must cope with external exigencies or external elements that are sometimes transforming. And as the systems transform, then as the context transforms, then the systems should transform and have the ability to transform. So that will be the first of the functional imperatives. A system, to be reliable and survive, needs to be able to adapt, right? Probably goes back to also these ideas of evolution that are now prevalent in all over the Western civilization and elsewhere. Adaptation. The second functional imperative will be the goal attainment. A system has to be able to define specific goals to be attained to keep an internal dynamic going on. Without the setting up of these goals, the system is idle, and idleness leads to death and disarticulation. So what are the goals? Well, the goals are those objectives that are understood, defined, and embraced by the system as the reason for the system to exist, right? The third of the functional imperatives will be integration. And integration, Talcott Parsons, and I'm reading straight from his writing, he states that a system must regulate the interrelationship of its component parts. So it's actually thinking of it in inwardly. That is, the different parts of a subsystem, how are those parts related to each other? It must also arrange the relationship among the other 3 functional imperatives. So there's an internal component of integration, and then there's also how integration has to do with goal attainment, adaptation, and latency, which is the pattern maintenance that I was referring to. So that is integration. So the subsystem has to have the means to keep those things making sense when they work together, right? And then latency or pattern maintenance, this is a really interesting one. And this is where culture is embraced by Talcott Parsons. Culture gives subsystems of action the ability to recognize patterns that are worth deploying when the need arises. As I have posted here in my presentation, the function of pattern maintenance refers to the imperative of maintaining the stability of patterns of institutionalized culture, defining the structure of the system. Or in other words, the system needs to furnish, maintain, and renew both the motivation of individuals and then the cultural patterns to create and sustain that motivation. So how do you keep the system alive? Is by having readily available these elements of motivation for those individuals that are integrating the subsistence system and the social. Why do we go out and vote? Well, there's many different reasons. When we think our interests will be affected by the outcome of an election, we tend to go out and vote. So that would be and the pattern that is maintained is we have certain ways of voicing our political opinion. We have to register, we have to go one day, we have to write something in a piece of paper, and then we have to place that into a box. That's a pattern of action. And that pattern needs to be latent, needs to be present whenever we need it or when the time comes, so that we can attain our goals, keep ourselves related to other members of the society, and then adapt to changing elements in the environment. So I think that might be a good way to understand this paradigm that he is presenting to us in order to understand the mechanisms, the way systems and subsystems work in society. I would like to finish my presentation today with a couple of things, and we're done. One is just a list of the work, the most important pieces of writing that Talcott Parsons engaged in. And it's important to keep these ones in mind, as again, Parsons is perhaps the most prominent of the sociologists of the 20th century. So of course it's the Structure of Social Action in 1937, which is when he is mostly presenting the idea that of the unity of act. The unity of act is a very central concept in his work, and the unity of act means that we behave the way we behave because of the way the act is related to values and context and conditions of action. And this unity of act, I tried to explain this in class the other day. This unity of act basically states that we are behaving in certain ways because there are a series of values and ideas and norms that were presented to us as we were socialized, and then we use those elements. Those elements constrain the nature of our response, and that is, in a nutshell, the idea of the structure of social action. Again, we have elements of values, behavioral patterns, and ideas that are socialized into us, that we use always and we refer to when making decisions in terms of our action in a social context. Problem with this idea is that it becomes problematic when it comes to determining the morality of the act. So am I responsible for my response, or is my response actually to be explained and therefore causated by those elements that have been socialized with? So to what extent I am responsible for that? That is where he was for the most time, as he was writing The Social System, Economy and Society with Smeltzer, and then The Structure and Process in Modern Societies. As he continues progressing in his trajectory, particularly since the 1960s and certainly in the 70s, he starts having more and more of a problem trying to understand and explain this paradoxical situation that his initial position on the unity of act has created. And he kind of moves away from that one, and he is more and more interested in just explaining the functional aspects of his theory, mostly what I just explained in terms of the paradigm of the agile paradigm, functional imperatives in society, right? So when you read the action theory and the human condition, you will see how he's departing from those tenets of his initial idea of social action, which, by the way, comes straight out of the idea of social action that was initially proposed by Max Weber. But I want to finish with highlighting 5 elements that he identifies, or 5 postulates that he identifies as critical to understand the importance of sociological theory. And this is sort of the takeaway, the last takeaway that I want you to remember from Parsons. He is really aspiring, and he contributes immensely to the consolidation of social theory and social sciences as clearly defined, solidly defined fields of human inquiry. So for a theory to be such, it has to comply with at least 5 fundamental elements or postulates. First, it must be recognized as fundamentally important to any science. So what I have to say about the social and the predictive capacity of social sciences needs to be equally relevant to any other of the social sciences. Just like what the physicist have to say about the physical world that we live in should be important for us in order to understand the social world. So it must be recognized as fundamentally important to any science. Otherwise, it's not scientific knowledge. Must have social systems, must explain social systems. Otherwise, you're just explaining a part of it, and maybe you're not fully fledged discipline and theory in its own. Then he feels strongly about the idea that it must conform to the structural functional type. So that's the one paradigm that needs to be used to explain the social. It must be formulated, number 4, within an action frame of reference. So, in other words, the core of any social scientific theory should be to explain action and social action more specifically. And then, last but not least, it must have genuinely operational concepts, which is the way he presents, mostly by means of schemes and paradigms and typologies, the way he represents the social. Because ultimately what this means is that he sees the social as a patterned set of behaviors and actions that happened out there, and that's what the social scientists are there to explain and understand. Okay, so I'm gonna leave my presentation of Parsons at this moment, and then I'm going to ask you to take a look at the instructions that I'm posting right below this short clip as to the short exercise that we're going to be doing today. So it's not a long exercise, but it is a short exercise because I really want to give you enough time to focus on the preparation of your reports on the reading of Tufekci. So just take a look at that clip that I'm posting right below this one.